You're listening to Dropping Pins, a story-based learning series from the OKS Hunter podcast, hosted by Derek Melkor, and aimed at helping you hone your whitetail hunting skills. You'll hear the aha moments when known and unknown proven whitetail killers started consistently putting mature bucks on the ground.
All right. Hey, everybody. Derek here from Dropping Pins, our podcast sponsored by the OKS Hunter podcast. Really excited. We got a morning podcast today, so I'm sipping on some coffee, talking to a gentleman that I followed on social media for a long time, and I really loved picking up little tidbits and knowledge from him over the years. The gentleman we're having on this morning is not only a big buck killer and found his own success in the woods, but he thinks about things a lot different because he's also a guide. So he's constantly trying to stay on top of deer movement and understanding what big bucks are doing in the terrain around his area. Runs his own guide service, Sherk's Guide Service, in the PA wilds, the public lands of Pennsylvania. If any of you guys have followed him on social media, you know that he is an educator at heart, because a lot of his posts about trail cams, big buck movements, are geared at helping people kind of make realizations that he's got over the years. So I thought he would be a perfect guest on our Dropping Pins podcast, since that is our main goal, is to help the OKS hunter, or people who are a little bit fresher, greener in their hunting career, make some jumps. And those people who want to do a little bit better or have a little bit more insight, I think Steve Sherk is a great guy to learn from. So I was lucky enough to steal a little bit of his time. He's on a family vacation. But Steve, welcome to the Dropping Pins podcast. We appreciate you taking some time away from your vacation to sit down and talk deer with us. How you doing, bud?
I'm doing real well. Certainly, I'm actually thankful to get a little break from the beach and have a little bit of alone time to, talk deer hunting. So I appreciate the opportunity just for that.
Yeah, that's great, man. And as I mentioned earlier, I'd love to just get out in the open for our listeners. For anyone who's not seen your stuff or heard any of your podcasts before, just clarify for our listeners, what kind of terrain have you kind of grown up hunting? Do you spend most of your time in now and run your guide service? So like we kind of have a little bit of background as to where your knowledge base is coming from. What kind of stuff have you been in?
Yep. I'm 100% public land, big woods, mountainous terrain. I've never hunted private land before. It's what I grew up in. From day one I've ever stepped foot in the woods, it's been that. So I wouldn't even know how to make a food plot or how to manage any land. I'm a straight up big woods, mountain buck, public land hunter. So that's all man. I am. But I'm sure you got a lot of listeners that are kind of in the same boat as me.
Heck yeah. And that was kind of I was real excited to get you on, just because of how long you've hunted that terrain. I know, you're up in a big national forest area, and a few of our first guests here, I'm from Wisconsin, grew up in northeastern Wisconsin, which is our big woods of northern Wisconsin, but it's very different than the big woods of what you guys are in. Like, I feel like you've got more opportunity for vast wilderness, just from what I've seen, heard, and noticed on the maps. We've got national forest, which is, there's hundreds of thousands of acres, but man, we've got a lot of access in our big woods. So what we refer to here as big woods, I think, is probably a little bit different from some of the spots that you guys get to hunt up there. It just seems more vast, and opportunities to get away from maybe other people.
Yeah, we do have a mixture. There's areas that, are kind of smaller and closed, but then there's some areas that are more remote. So it kind of just depends on what you're used to or what you like. But I kind of, wherever there's big deer, whether it's a big remote area or just maybe a smaller pocket, it doesn't really matter to me. But
yeah, there's some different things that I have a few, selfish questions for you maybe later on, but I don't want to steer anything in the beginning here. As you know, we're trying to do a little bit of story based more than just tactics, so people can kind of make those learning moments and assumptions for themselves. So before I steer you in any direction and distract you, do you have any kind of story or experience that you had whether it was your own hunting, successful, unsuccessful, guiding, whatever, that kind of helped you have a little bit of an aha moment as far as what big deer were doing compared to maybe hunting, different age class deer?
Yeah, I think it's when I really started to pay attention to a lot of trail cam data work. I at one time, I don't know, I might have ran 20, 30 trail cams, which really isn't a lot given the amount of area that that I'm hunting. But I would just kind of occasionally go through the cards and notice like, geez, October 25th, why did I get so many pictures? Or why were so many big deer moving that day? And I started to notice just certain days, certain times of the year, that I'd see these jumps and movement, especially with mature bucks, and I was like, you know what? I'm really going to start paying more attention to this. Start journaling things. Start combing through this data, collecting it, and observing it. And when I started doing that, that's when I really started to learn like how certain times of the year and certain times of the year when you get cold fronts and different weather scenarios, that's when I was really seeing these spikes in movement. So then once I started doing that, I was able to look ahead throughout the season, maybe sometimes up to a week in advance, and to really know when you can capitalize, when some of these weather scenarios, based on time of the year, I would really know when are these key times that I should be out there. And when I really started hunting more around the weather, and, that type of stuff, just based off of the data I was collecting, I really think that's what had my biggest impact on my own hunting, on the guiding. Now, unfortunately, though, for the guiding, like I can't tell everyone, hey, we're going to get this big cold front on Halloween and everybody come. Like there's a lot of people that come and the weather's crappy. Just different things can happen. That's just part of it. But there's definitely times where the hunting is almost 10 times better, based on weather. And once again, that's really probably been the ultimate factor of me just knowing that you can really capitalize in these certain situations.
So, I mean, that's any kind of trip, even if it's a do-it-yourself, an unguided trip. You're always a victim to whatever the weather is going to be that week, because you don't get to choose, and most guys can't switch their vacation days last minute because the cold front's going to miss a day or two, early or a day or two late. But I'm sure you've noticed, but I'll just throw it out there just to point out the obvious. But through your guiding, I'm sure just having more bodies in the woods than just yourself. Like you see a good weather day, you can still be, a little bit off in the spot you pick. But do you notice that, like, obviously that little maybe later in October, like when the bucks are getting a little bit more pre-ruddy, and then you get that cold weather front or those weather fronts that you've kind of learned to look for? Are your clients like, is it kind of a no-brainer? Like, when you see those things lining up, are they seeing a lot more mature deer on their feet? Like, is that what you've observed over the years?
100%. Like, it's just amazing the difference of success, what they're seeing when everything kind of, turns into a prime event, time of year and weather included. And then, the biggest thing for me is maybe jumping slightly off that is trying to do just as well when we don't have prime conditions. Like that's what I really striving for, in the past several years, like how to still have good success, because you can't, especially in a business, like I can't just hope for like everything to be perfect weather-wise each year. So, yeah,
You're not like building some kind of
I'm
secret
really
weather machine.
Yeah, I wish. But yeah, that's what I've really been trying to do. Like, one thing I'm finding, for instance, when we get hot weather here, that a lot of our deer are going down lower. For instance, too, one thing in the mountains is heat rises. So generally, when you get hot weather, hotter temperatures, at some point, a lot of that heat's going to extend up into higher elevations, and it'll get cooler lower. So, we've been learning things like that. We got to hunt lower that time of year too. Also, there's not a lot of green browse when we're guiding because we're guiding in the rut. So up to like 50% of a deer's water throughout like the early fall, spring, and summer is what they eat, that green browse. So when a lot of that green starts to die off, they tend to seek out more natural water, which is generally lower when in mountain country. So that's another thing. When it's hot, they're going to be closer to those streams, which are, generally down lower. So you learn a lot of those kind of things, how to adjust. Because, I mean, if we have good weather, I'm not saying like our success rates are like 90%, but like if we get a lot of really good weather, it gets really good. And I've I don't want to say I've mastered that, but like I've really taken advantage of it over the years, and I'm well prepared for it, and to have success. But I'm more focused on now, how can I have success when things aren't really cooperating weather-wise, and certain situations like that.
I'm really glad you brought up the idea of browse, because that is such, I mean, it's becoming talked about more and more by people who know about it, especially big woods guys, clear cut stuff. But browse is something that's
Yep.
so underrated, even on like private land. Like everybody's so into food plots and into the egg fields, but deer are mainly eating browse most
Yep.
of the time. And if your property is void of browse and undergrowth, you are really, really missing out. And you kind of mentioned that hunting lower, cooler temperatures, and there's going to be a little bit more, hopefully, moisture rich browse around. I was scouting with a buddy on Tuesday. He made the trip down by me, and we were looking on the maps at some places to go. And one of the areas on some public that I've been hunting is a little bit more lowland. And on the map, it just looks like open grassy stuff. But having walked in there, the soil is very moist. It's lowland. So a lot of the plants that grow up there, although they kind of just look like any old prairie type plants, what I've noticed is you take and break them open and they're very rich, with moisture. And there's tons of deer sign in there in the summer.
Yep.
And then we looked at a spot that looked very similar on the map. We're like, oh, that must be the same kind of stuff. But we got in there and it was very sandy soil. And to the naked eye, it just kind of looked like the same terrain, but very few deer tracks in there. And you go and break open any of those plants, and it was just a much different moisture content, which is like a small little detail. But I noticed, man, the deer are in that browse that's full of water, full of moisture, especially on a drier year or like a hotter time, like you mentioned. I totally see exactly what you're talking about in that.
Yep. And deer, it's not even like a flavor thing. It's not like, it's more of a survival thing. Like they are going to, especially this time of year when it's hot, like, if they can get both the food and water, in a smaller area, they don't have to work very hard to survive. Like, they're going to take advantage of that stuff. Their bodies are telling them like, hey, stay put here, mostly because you don't have to travel a half mile to that stream or that pond. Or I'm not saying they don't drink, natural fresh water as well, but really this time of year, a lot of their water comes from what they eat, and they can tend to be lazy and build up those fat reserves for the fall just by staying in some of these pockets of browse and hardly moving, and getting everything they need from what they're eating for the most part.
For those of you who have not, I think it was an Exodus Outdoors podcast that you kind of unpacked a whole bunch of your trail camera data maybe a year or two ago. Maybe you do it every year, but I know I listened to one episode. I think it was on Exodus, but you had, your spreadsheet. And for anybody who's not listened to that, like if you're really interested in mature buck movement, like that was such an informative piece of information that you put together. Cause I like what Steve's does here is, obviously as a hunting guide, nighttime pictures of big bucks are not going to be as important as any daytime movement. So Steve kind of went through and documented the days where he had mature bucks during daylight, which are the most important photos that you can get. Especially, if you're hunting them, obviously, like you need to know where they're moving in daylight. And one of the things that I talked about in one of the silly little scouting videos that I did, and I kind of recommended like just buying a whole bunch of cheap cameras if you're newer to it or newer to hunting big deer, because making choices as to where to put your cameras to try to capture daylight buck movement, whether you're hunting off that data that season or not. But it's almost like you're making more and more hunting choices with every camera you hang. And I was just kind of talking about how I thought the educational part of that, and you saying like, okay, I want to hang in this spot. If you got 20 cameras, you're making a lot more choices than if you have 2 cameras. And I think a guy like you who's running over 100 cameras, like I just think of how good you got at fine tuning where cameras are for summer buck movements, because you've already got big bucks moving through your cameras. I've seen you post on Instagram. So like, I know the cameras are beneficial. Have you had any takeaways, like maybe earlier in your trail camera, you know, when you've been setting them up, like to figure out where these big deer are? Did that play any part in how you hunt them? Like, do you hang cameras where you think you're going to get daylight movement? Are you hanging them just to get pictures of them no matter what the time? Like, maybe talk a little bit about some instance that kind of clued you in on what you need to be doing with those to maximize your daylight buck movement. I don't know. I'm just going off some tangent here, but
Sure.
I know
Yeah,
you.
no,
I know you've got good
I'll
knowledge
be
of
honest.
it.
Yep. I mean, honestly, I've learned that you really have to have, a good wide broadcast of cameras in a lot of different areas, different types of areas, different types of habitat, different elevations, because every year can be different too. We're hunting public land that's not managed pretty much at all. Some years you're going to have mass crops. Some years they're going to clear cut here. Just there's so many different factors that change from each season, that from one season to the next, it doesn't mean what you did last season or where you hunted last season is going to be good again. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So, the more versatile you are in your camera setups, really the more better information you're going to get. That's what I've done over the years. Just try to be very versatile with it, and even changing as the years go by. I'm not saying that a lot of things stay the same for me. I'm constantly evolving and adapting, but really just being very versatile, covering a lot of ground, wide, pretty large amount of ground. It's really, that's been the key for me. I unfortunately, I might not, that might not be the answer everyone wanted to hear, because it's not like there really is that just one golden way of doing this.
Yep.
But just, I've got cameras on scrapes, I got cameras on trails, I got cameras on food sources, some near bedding, some in between, some just down closer to water. It's just like, it's so all over the place that's what really makes it good. I'm kind of covering everything, that I think I possibly can, covering just so many different situations. But I think the versatility aspect of it is the key.
I'm sure you've had some experience in making some observations. I mean, you kind of mentioned it, but like, just because you had, and let's just stick to cameras for a minute, not even hunting, but I'm sure you've had instances where like, and I've done it, where you get some great pictures one season, you got a couple good bucks or one good buck that you're chasing, and he's all over your cameras. And the next season,
Yeah.
you go and you kind of stick them back in the same spots, expecting the same results. But like you just said, if you're not versatile, I've had it before where like that deer's still there, but according to what you got on the camera, it doesn't look like he's there because something has
Yep.
just changed a little bit. And like those movement patterns, whether it was just noticing you or your cameras, like it's just shifted a little bit. And if you didn't get versatile and like just try moving him around, you'd have never known he was there. Have you seen a lot of that in the big woods? Food sources
100
change like crazy.
100%. Like, so many years, like we'll have a spot, like, or for instance, like I'll even go by like a camera, like this camera site was the best. This produced the most mature bucks, or maybe the most deer activity or most buck activity one year. And you're like, man, that's going to be the spot next year. And I swear to God, I've seen that be the worst spot the next season. So doesn't mean that the whole general area is going to be the worst or going to turn bad, but there's just so many different factors that can have an influence on, on each season and each week or each day, that things are constantly changing out there. The biggest key I will say is like to pay attention to is, don't look at it as like a small spot, but like you just always want to stay in the ballpark, and that might even be like a square half mile area. Like if a certain area or a certain location was good last year, it is very likely that maybe that general area is going to be good again, unless it's food or, certain other factors that can change. But like when it comes to individual bucks and what they do from each season, like a lot of your bucks have rut areas. A lot of them have like wintering areas. Some of them even have an area just for almost every season, like spring, summer, and fall. A lot of that doesn't change. That deer will likely go to those same areas, and that's what you're trying to pay attention to. And that's another reason why I love running cameras 365 days a year, because I know where that deer summers, I know where he winters, I know where he ruts. Like, just knowing those general areas is really key. Not always that specific spot. Like a lot of times that does change. So, but just I always say it's really all about just being in the ballpark. You want to get yourself in the ballpark. At least you're in the game if you're there. If you're not on the playing field, then you don't stand a chance. But just don't expect that deer just to do the same exact thing every year. I'm not saying that some won't do that occasionally, but they're not quite that predictable, especially in the big woods, public land.
Mm-hmm.
But you just want to get yourself in the ballpark, and that's the biggest key for me.
What you just explained about the ballpark thing had me thinking back to I saw one of your videos. I'm not sure what YouTube channel it was on, but you were out doing some scouting and hanging cameras around like one of your, a bed on a hillside that was in a younger clear cut. And it got me thinking what you were just saying with the changes. Like one of the biggest changes I've noticed between like a spot being a good spot one year and being devoid of deer the next year is like, I'm just picturing you got a clear cut on a hillside. You had some buck bed that you were trying to monitor and you were placing cameras around it. But like obviously in the big woods where the destination or the big food sources are somewhat limited, like obviously you got a bumper crop of acorns one year that's north of that spot. If your camera's between that buck's bed and those acorns, it's going to be lit up. But all of a sudden the next year, there's no acorns dropping there. There's far less need for him to move in that direction, and he's moving a different direction. So like you said, you're ballparking it, you throw some cameras around the perimeter on some exit trails, and all of a sudden you might realize that it wasn't dead. He's just going this other direction because this little knob over here has got a couple red oak acorns dropping. But if you don't make that walk and put the scouting, put your boots on the ground, you're never going to know that. And the buck was under your thumb the whole time. You just had no clue he's there.
Yep. Nope. That's absolutely right. And I will say what I have found to be the biggest influence on bucks changing is hunting pressure. Doesn't take a whole lot of pressure to, a lot of times it doesn't entirely boot a buck out of an area, but that pressure will dictate everything he's doing throughout the day and almost even at night. So he might be making a big loop around an area. He might just, you might think, oh, he's nocturnal this year, but it's just because of pressure and he's using other parts more in the day. So I will say, because, we're talking a lot about food and weather and, that kind of stuff, but I can't emphasize enough how much hunting pressure, it's the number one factor towards mature buck activity and having an effect on it. And, if you might have an area one year, and I see this a lot, like, you might, for instance, if it's me or someone I know, they kill a good deer in an area. A lot of times people hear about it, and then you get a bunch of people thinking the next year there's going to be a big deer in there. Like that happens a lot. And then once you throw that pressure in there, it really changes the ball game. And another thing too, and I might be beating around the bush a little bit, but like I used to be a big clear cut. Yeah. But I used to love hunting clear cuts, but now anymore, just due to, all the technology, satellite imagery, like clear cuts are just being hunted so heavily now and targeted so heavily that I'm seeing an opposite effect. I'm not even joking or fibbing at all here. Like, I'll see almost as much sign as I used to in a clear cut, especially the younger ones that are full of food, full of browse. But a lot of that activity is at night, and a lot of hunters get fooled because they go in there, they've targeted, from their phone, and like, wow, look at all the sign, rubs everywhere, just tracked up really good, and then it's all night activity. So I focus more on overlook stuff, like stuff that you can't find, from your phone, basically.
Hmm.
There's a lot of areas like we have like a lot of dead ash from what's called the emerald ash borer. So they're
We've got the same
diseased, and a
thing
lot of
here.
these ash, yeah, so a lot of the ash have died, which in return has allowed like a lot of sunlight to reach the forest floor in those areas. And it's almost like, honestly, it's almost like clear cutting, because there's no overstory. It's just wide open, because the ash trees don't have leaves anymore, and a lot of them are just starting to fall over and die anyway. So like stuff like that, just finding those pockets, that a lot of just boots on the ground scouting, a lot of that hidden underbrush, hidden understory. That's where a lot of the big deer are at in the daytime now, in those hidden areas, because the clear cuts are being targeted so much.
That is such a good example of just, being detailed in your scouting. And, I know you do a lot of postseason scouting and noticing like dead ash trees and then like getting more vegetation growing up in there. Like that's something that, takes some woodsmanship and some years to be able to put those, observations into like, oh, that's why this is happening. But that's something that I guess, is a huge thing for beginning guys to learn, is like there's so many things that influence those bucks to do what they do. And I'm glad you
Yep.
mentioned the clear cut thing, because so many of the apps now, the mapping apps are so good. Like, they have the years of the cuts labeled on there. So you can say, oh,
Yep.
this one was a 2020, and then there's a 2022 right here. Oh, that's probably a great transition, two different, like everybody can see that. One
Yep.
of the things I noticed is we had like a real big windstorm come through a bunch of the national forest where I'm at. So there was just blowdowns for, thousands of acres, probably tens of thousands of acres, blowdowns, which made it really interesting because there was pockets of open timber, that were sheltered, and then you had blowdowns, and it was great for the deer. For a year or two, it made areas really hard to hunt. Nobody wanted to go in there because getting them out was impossible. But now they've gone in and started logging all that fallen timber. So there's clear cuts everywhere. And one thing that I've kind of noticed is in that particular situation, the old cuts that are like 20, 25 years old, grown up with like popple and some maple mixed in, those didn't get
Sure.
much windblown damage because those trees were flexible. And those have just become amazing big buck hideouts because there's pockets of it. They're
Yep.
surrounded by food, so they're not necessarily in those open clear cuts. But I found a lot of beds in those a little bit older cuts that are just starting to get some like dead popples falling down and whatnot. Man, they seem to really, really like those spots in my area.
Absolutely. And that's just like an adjustment. Like, we're always having to adapt. You're always having to keep an eye on your areas, how they're changing. Could be one simple weather event that can change a whole area. You get a tornado or really bad windstorm, that's going to have a big influence on the habitat in that area. Plus, like I said, we got a lot of logging in my area. You can never just base on like everything staying the same. Every season, you got to be able to expect everything to probably be different in that area. You're going to have to make changes, adjustments, and really that's part of why I like it so much. Is like there's never really a dull season or a dull moment. Like, you're constantly learning, you're constantly adapting, and that's what makes it fun. Every day is really a new day out there. Every season by far is definitely that. I think that's why I've never went to anything else but the public land, because there's just so much challenge, and there's just so much you constantly are learning. That's what I love about it.
And that's something that I've mentioned a few times just in this little segment, because this one is obviously geared at some educational moments and kind of showing those moments
Yeah.
that made people think differently. And it's obvious, it's without a doubt, the people with a growth mindset or who are good at reflecting and thinking critically of what's going on in the woods. And I mean, most of these people are doing it for their jobs or whatnot, but the people who are good at looking back and putting those pieces together and not just going, oh, I didn't see crap, or, well, he was on my camera, but he, didn't show up every time I was there. Well, why was that? Like, you got to think about it in that perspective. Otherwise, those are the people who tend to get burned out and frustrated by hunting in general, because they can't wrap their head around, oh, I've hunted the same spot. It was good the first year and it's year 5 and I haven't shot anything in 4 years. But they just like haven't wanted to play that mental game. Like it is a challenge and you've got to freaking relearn it every season. And there's people who love that. And then there's people who absolutely are not interested in that.
Yep. And you brought up a good point. Like, honestly, over the years, I've put more thought into my mistakes and my failures than I have my successes, because in the long run, I've learned that I actually learn more from my failures than the having success. I mean, I'll be honest with you. There's been a few times I probably wasn't even doing a whole lot right, and I just got lucky. But it's so much easier to learn, like, I can't do this, or I can eliminate that area. Like, you learn, I swear, much more from those mistakes you're making, than just having success constantly. And it also too, I think, because I've strived so hard to have success, because it's just I love deer hunting. I'm so passionate, like I can't get enough of it. That I think the failures are almost like wounds, like they sting really bad, and I tend to have a hard time like getting my mind off where I failed. So I think about it so much, where in the long run, I really learned something from it. So I think that's a big key too. Like if you are struggling to have success, you know, look at it from a different point and be like, you know what, I can actually learn a lot from where I'm at, these days, and take something good from those failures versus just beating yourself up and telling yourself, you're never going to have success because you're doing things wrong. I mean, that's not a bad place to be in as far as from a learning standpoint.
Yeah, it's how you look at it. And I'm gonna ask you in a minute here, so I'll just preface it. So if you need to think for a second, and then I'll talk a little bit about something that goes along with that. But I am gonna ask you, and I didn't ask you to prepare for this question, but since you just mentioned it, I'm gonna ask you maybe if you've got a story of maybe one that got away that you botched an opportunity, or weren't hunting them right because of you didn't know this, but maybe that helped you make those big learning strides and put the scar on your arm, as you mentioned, that now you kind of wear as a badge of honor. If you've got a story about maybe one that got away, or you wish you would have got, or one buck that taught you something, I'd love to hear that in a minute. But what you were just talking about, like not being able to be successful, or holding that as a detriment versus as a learning opportunity. One thing early in my hunting career is, man, growing up, watching deer hunting stuff from the 90s and reading the magazines. Hey, buddy. Okay. Sorry, my son just came down. Wants a hug. Watching that kind of stuff and seeing where those guys were having success in hunting.
Can I throw this away?
Yes, please. Can you grab the other one too?
Can I throw that shield?
Yes.
Yeah.
Give one to your sister. Sorry. Seeing where those guys were having success, it kind of gets burned in your brain. And then especially like growing up hunting the national forest, the big woods, you're hunting, like I'm trying to set up where these like, the real tree guys are, like these oak flats that are open, you can see forever. And I just wasn't seeing deer or big deer. And after a while, one of those, like, reflecting, like, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? One of the things that really, really helped me was I started asking myself every time I stopped and found a spot that like interested me, which earlier in my hunting career is mostly just like a lot of trails, right? Like, oh, look at all these trails crossing. This is a good spot. I'd have to pinch myself. And I started asking myself every time, not where have like you've seen it in videos, but where have I ever seen a big buck walk through a spot like this in daylight? And the answer was almost always no. I've never seen one do that. So then just move on. Like you got to find something different. And that's what eventually just started leading. Like, I just hunted thickets, and the thicker it was, the better it was. The more, stem count there was, the more deer I saw. So that question of, have I seen mature deer move through this before? Nope. Then I just kept moving. That was one of like my big learning points that got me from not seeing any mature deer or big deer to starting to see some. And that was like one of the breadcrumbs along the way, or the pins that was dropped in my mind that started helping me figure out, where these deer were moving in daylight. So
Sure. Yeah. And I've given it some time. Like I'll even go back this last season. Like, in fact, this year, a lot of people will probably be surprised, but I'm probably not even going to be bow hunting that much this year, just for the fact that my son's so heavy into basketball that time of year, and like with the guiding, now I do all the cooking. like my time to bow hunt anymore is just getting so minimal that like it's just I'm the type of person, I'm either gonna go all out at something. I don't want to just go 3-4 times a year. Like it just doesn't. I don't get anything out. Like I want to take something seriously or not do it. So with the
Mm-hmm.
guiding now, I think I'm gonna bow hunt this year. But certainly with guiding, like I feel like I'm hunting though. Like I'm doing all the work for everyone. I'm pretty much doing everything, but they're just the one doing the shooting or the killing. So I'm fortunate to have that. But for myself, last year I did want to. I tried to hunt, a little bit more than usual during the earlier part of season before I started guiding. I mean, I didn't get out a ton, but a little more than the past few years. And there were two different deer I targeted, and both of them, man, I really screwed up on there, and some of it was just timing. But like I had going into the season, I was gonna hunt this one 9 point. In fact, I had him like pegged until like it was probably until like or September, maybe 26th, and our season I think literally came in like 28th or 29th last year. But he did a complete change on me. In fact, once we got like that full moon in September, and that's another thing I am paying more attention to is the moon. But like he did like not even a big shift, but like a 200-yard shift, and just completely fooled me, ghosted me as far as his bedding pattern. But really, all it was seemed like once we got that full moon in September, he started bedding closer to does. Like I probably am not bragging, but like I think I would have killed that buck on opening day, had he not shifted, because I had a cell cam on this lone white oak tree just outside of his bedding area, and like I'd say about 4 evenings a week in the daylight, he'd hit that white oak. So it was
Wow.
just a
That's about as
probably
good.
oh
That's
yeah,
as
it
good a
was.
pattern as you can get in the big woods. That's amazing.
Yeah, and like I said, it was on a cell cam, and I'm just watching, and like, holy cow! I mean, this is unbelievable. This is perfect. And literally, like, it just seemed like once we got that full moon, it just triggered something. And he shifted his bedding like 200 yards and just was way more unpredictable. Plus, he went a little bit lower on the mountain where I didn't have cell service anymore, so I couldn't get like that instant intel, and I didn't even have cameras set up for that adjustment. But like every year I see a shift like this. It may not be that same time, but you'll see some years bucks, and that's what I call like rut shift. Some years it's like mid-October, some years it's a little earlier. It seemed like last year in a lot of areas for us it was earlier. And another thing that's kind of weird is like if like these are little things you got to pay attention to every year, but if we have a good acorn crop in areas, I'll see bucks in those areas getting more ruddy and rut shifting sooner than I will in areas where there's no acorns. And what I think it has to do with is fat reserves, because with those acorns, they can build up fat reserves extremely fast. And like, plus their bodies are telling them like in this area, we're going to have good food in the rut. So I do think those bucks get more aggressive early. I'm not saying the does coming to heat anytime sooner, but like bucks will have much more rut behavior early in those areas. So I really screwed up on that buck. Like I should have thought that he was going to shift on me sooner than what he did, and like I was just like completely stunned that he changed his pattern like 2 days before archery season. So then there was another buck that like in another area where there wasn't as good of an acorn crop, and like I kicked myself because 2 years in a row, this would be the third year, he stays in the same bedding area all summer. Even it's like mid-October when he makes that shift and those changes, and like I don't know why I didn't hunt that deer, but I couldn't cell cam that area because there wasn't enough cell reception. But I had cameras like on this, or especially had a camera on this scrape that's right on the outside edge of his bedding area, and that's something that I find to be a really good tactic, especially in bedding areas where there's a lot of food, like there's a lot of browse in this buck's bedding area. So a lot of people think when they leave a bedding area, and they do head to a primary food source, that those bucks are just like coming out of there with an empty belly, almost running to those acorns or whatever it is. But it's honestly opposite. Like a lot of these bedding areas, they're feeding all day because there's so much food and cover in there. And a lot of times what they do is before they leave or when they enter, they'll work a scrape on that outer edge, because like it's almost like them checking to see if any deer have been in the perimeter or like near there. Also, they're kind of like marking their territory, like, hey, I don't want anyone coming back here. This is my spot. And that buck has done like the same thing a few years in a row in the early season. And I completely never, and that was might have been the biggest deer I had, or one of the biggest deer I had on trail cam last year. But like, I didn't put any time in that on that buck in the early season. And maybe these aren't situations where I can really give to someone where I learned something a lot. It was like, but where I'm going with this is like more like just like mental errors and not putting enough thought into it. Like I got more focused like on that buck hitting that white oak tree so regularly, especially later in September, that I kind of crossed everything off the list. And I really went into that early season with just like a plan A and not a plan B. And that's really what killed me. I just was so focused on one thing, and that's something I want anyone that's listening to take out of this is like maybe not get so focused on one deer always or one thing. Like make sure you have other options, because when option A doesn't work, it's hard to just the next day go to plan B when you haven't put any thought into it. Like I'm very confident I would have killed that other buck had I not have I didn't even think of that other deer. That's what I mean. I was so focused on that one big 9 that other buck that was even bigger has been doing the same thing for years. I should have just went and hunted him. Just totally fooled myself. And that's another thing too with those cell cams is like seeing those instant pictures versus the other bucks a mile back in. I might go a couple months sometimes without checking that camera on that scrape, but that cell cam it just got me. Seeing those pictures, I thought I had that buck pegged and I was going to end my season early, and that was not the case.
I think that's a really tough one though, because for anyone, you say that's the takeaway, have the plan B, but for anybody who's hunting an area that, it's hard to establish any consistency with deer, like, the terrain you're hunting, when you get those pictures, you kind of set up in your mind, like you're already patterned, like you get something that's it feels so solid to you that like my brain would work the same way. And I'd be like, this is going to be it. This is what I have to do. And it's hard to deviate that, because man, it's like you got the golden goose just laid you an egg, and I can see where it would be a one-way train and you would just have to stick with that.
Yep.
Hey,
yeah,
buddy,
that's
can you
exactly
give me a couple more minutes?
What happened.
Can you go upstairs for a couple?
Can you help me with the Apple ID code?
I sure can in a couple minutes. Can you go upstairs?
Hi.
Thanks, bud. But yeah, so I think that's a tough one. That's a really, really tough one. I did have one question about the scrape the second buck was hitting. Is that a natural scrape that he made, or do you do a lot with mock scrapes in front of your cameras, or was that one of his own?
Yeah, I mean, I do tons of mock scrapes, but that was a natural scrape. The only thing I've had to do over the years is I keep adding a licking branch to it. Usually I'll hang like a beech limb, and once or twice a year, I'll put a new limb on it. But it's one of the best spots I have, and honestly, I've only ever even hunted it a couple times. But this one certain deer, he lived there and used that bedding area a few years in a row, and even throughout the summer he's there. Once again, he doesn't shift till usually closer to mid-October. It's just one of those prime spots. Like, I don't have a lot of those spots, but it's just kind of in a perfect world. There's no pressure in there. It's way back in. The habitat's perfect, and it's just the way that the deer usually like to leave that bedding area. You know, there's this big natural scrape on the outside edge that they love to hit. I mean, it's a golden spot. And I just, once again, I regret, like, my thing was, because it wasn't every night that buck was, or every evening that 9 point was hitting that white oak. But like I said, 3-4 evenings a week, you know, for about a 2 or 3 weeks. As soon as those white oaks started dropping, that buck was on them. And I just kept telling myself, like, if I just, you know, I only need 3 nights in the stand, probably only 1 or 2, you know, but I hunted a few nights and he doesn't show up. And, you know, by then that was pretty much my whole early season when I could have nailed that other buck in that other area. Just like I said, just so focused on one thing. And it just if our season would have been, I think, 2 or 3 days sooner, I probably would have had an opportunity at that year. It's just a matter just how things can change in the blink of an eye.
So once season opened and you hunted that white oak spot a couple times, was he still picking up acorns from that tree like later in the night, or did he just kind of abandon that whole area?
Never came to that tree. I left that camera there for most of October. He never came to that white oak again. There was a lot of other white oaks in that area. All that buck did was start paying more attention to does. The does were bedded 300-400 yards lower on the hill. And I thought that's what he would do anyways, but later that deer, because he didn't have to go back to that white oak. There's white oaks all through that area, but it was the white oaks in that area were more lower on the ridge. However, there was one white oak right tight to his bedding area. And I think the way he wanted to come out of that bedding area, and it was just like a perfect scenario. It was kind of right on the edge of that cover. He felt secure there, and he would hit that first white oak. I mean, I didn't have the camera on a scrape or anything, just on the perimeters of that white oak as he would eat the acorns. And it was just the most perfect scenario. In fact, we rarely get white oak acorns. Yeah, we rarely get white oak acorns. So, like, I've been waiting for years for that situation to happen. I knew about that white oak. I knew about that bedding area. I even knew the buck used that bedding area. Even I just had everything figured out. It was just that rut shift. Whenever that buck started to put more attention on does, he changed his bedding like 2 days. And it was not, I told a few people and they're like, oh, it had to been your pressure. But I'm telling you, I hunted it a few times, like 3 times. But I think our season came in on a Saturday. I think the last time he was there was like on the Tuesday before that. So, I mean, he went Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I literally just missed it. It wasn't my pressure. It was the fact that he just made that shift, right towards. And I saw other bucks, like I said, last year shift early in those areas with acorns. Like I said, they seem to get a jump start, with their rutting behavior.
The comment you made earlier about, noticing that difference when there's, a heavy acorn crop and just how that rutting behavior shifts. That was really interesting because I've kind of thought a similar thing, but for a different reason. But I think the physical element of their bodies building up fat reserves, like it's almost like a physical indicator, like their body's saying like, okay, hey, you're stocked up, tank is full. Like, let's get it going. Start establishing dominance. Like you've eaten all you need to eat. Like it's almost like a body signal. And I've never really thought of that before. What I've noticed in acorn areas, and I've learned this through shed hunting, which I know you love stumbling into a shed or two here. And some people don't see the value in shed hunting. But one thing I've learned from shed hunting areas that have leftover acorns is those deer in those areas will hold their antlers much longer than areas that are mainly browse focused, because deer can pick up browse anywhere and kind of stay away from other competition of bucks. But in those areas with isolated acorns on the ground, those bucks carry their antlers longer. I think just because they're, still a little bit of a pecking order, they're still competing a little bit for food because they're around more deer. So I've noticed they hold their antlers like a month longer than some of my deer in areas that don't have acorns.
Yeah. And acorns are the prime, like, fall winter food source. Like acorns were built to get deer through the fall and winter. Better than most browse that anywhere throughout the country. That's that's just the way the good Lord, Mother Nature made it. Like that's the perfect fall food. Except, especially where I'm at. See, we went 3 years without any acorns, and it's amazing. Like you go 3 years without hunting acorns, and you kind of forget some of the effects that acorns have. Like you don't totally forget it, but you just forget these little details. Like those bucks are going to act differently. They're going to be a little more ruddy early. They're going to shift early. All those little things, you kind of forget. And I was just a little rusty last year with the acorns and, in some parts of it. So, that's just part of it.
I'm sure you wrote down in your journal for the future, hey, if you're hunting food source of acorns, prepare for that rut switch a little bit earlier. I'm sure that's in your notes somewhere. I had one more question about the trail cam stuff. And you've probably covered this on some podcasts, but just for listeners here, because you run so much, you collect so much data, there's kind of that, I don't know who, mentioned it, but I heard at some point there's like a 7-day rule. And I was just curious what you've seen from year to year, mature bucks, doing their daylight movement with a similar weather pattern. Like, the gist of it is like a deer will do almost a very similar thing 1 year to the next, so long as the weather is kind of similar. And in my own personal experience, we hunted a number of big deer up in the national forest that, like, October 31st was a day that one of the biggest deer, typical 10-point we've ever hunted, we would get multiple daylight pictures of him on multiple cameras every year for 4 years on October 30th or the 31st. Like, that was his day. He daylighted everywhere. He just made his rounds. It was almost like he was scoping out like doe bedding areas in preparation. And like, we saw it every year for 4 years. Running as many cameras as you do, I mean, there must be some correlation. Do you see that also? Like, is that something that you're noticing?
Sure. I do think if I have the same weather from year to year, and that buck was kind of in the heart of that buck's rut area, if it is the rut, I would agree to a certain extent that is true. But overall, I rarely get like a buck at the same scrape, the same date every year. Same week though, like you did mention, maybe in a week period. I get a lot of them in a 5 to 7 day stretch, same area every year, because that's their rut area. But once again, the weather is going to play a big impact. A lot of times the weather even plays a part on whether he's daylighting or not. It just depends on year to year. Plus, like I said, the acorns seem to have a bigger effect this year. Like, this year, our October activity, even mid-October this past year, I should say, mid-October was definitely better than mid-November for us, like, especially in those acorn areas. So yes and no, like, there's never a buck like, I know a Halloween day, I'm going to hunt that scrape, he's going to show up. But yeah, probably in a week's period, he's going to probably cruise through there. But to know what day, it's not always that easy. So, yeah. But yeah, it's starting to rain outside, so I know my family's probably going to come in any minute. Just giving you a heads up. But I know we've been going close to an hour anyway.
I can hear the basement door opening up more frequently right now. My kids are getting a little rambunctious, so I think it's probably time we both.
Great.
Yeah, we got some tears, so I think it's time to wrap it up. Steve, I would just like to thank you for taking your time out of your morning here and talking deer with us. That was really nice of you. Anyone who's not following what Steve does, hold on one second, babe. I'm almost done. Okay. Follow Steve's Instagram page, Steve Sherk, Sherk's Guide Service. You'll learn a lot just following what he posts in his trail camera pictures. Best of luck this season for your hunters and yourself if you make it out. And good luck to your son doing some basketball. I really appreciate you sitting down with us today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, bud. It was great talking to you. Keep in touch.
All right. I'm going to end recording. You guys have a good one.